The first thing you should know is this: I didn't realize my life was about to explode the morning I stepped outside and found my driveway gone. Not cracked. Not blocked. Gone, swallowed under fresh concrete, and a smug smile from the HOA's queen of control, the woman everyone in our neighborhood quietly called Karen. That shock, that disbelief, that was the spark that started everything. I had lived on that street for 5 peaceful years. My driveway wasn't just pavement, it was where my son learned to ride his bike, where I worked on weekend projects, where our friends parked when they visited. It was part of my home, part of my life. But that morning, workers in neon vests stood where my car used to sit, pouring a wide, glistening slab that stretched straight into Karen's yard like a concrete tongue claiming territory. When I asked what was happening, Karen appeared with a clipboard and a fake polite smile sharp enough to cut glass. She said the HOA had rezoned shared parking access and that my driveway was now community utility space. But her tone made it clear, community meant hers. I told her she had no right. She told me to read the bylaws. I told her this was theft. She told me to calm down before the board issued a citation. That was the moment the anger set in, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't flare, but sinks deep and burns slow. I took pictures. I called the city. I called a surveyor. I printed every scrap of documentation I had ever signed. And the more I read, the more I realized something powerful. She hadn't just crossed the line, she had poured concrete over it. The surveyor confirmed it. The slab wasn't on community space. It wasn't shared land. It was fully, legally, unquestionably mine. Karen hadn't taken utility space. She had stolen my driveway straight across my property and turned it into her personal overflow parking pad. That's when my anger transformed into something sharper. A plan. Not loud. Not violent. Not reckless. Just devastating. Because if Karen wanted my driveway so badly, I was going to let her have it. On my terms and in a way she would never forget. That afternoon, the surveyor returned with orange stakes and a quiet confidence that felt like justice finally breathing. He walked the perimeter, checked his maps, then drove a metal spike beside the new concrete slab. The sound echoed like a gavel. Karen watched from her porch, arms crossed, pretending not to stare, but every second her jaw tightened. When he finished, he handed me the report and said 9 simple words: "Your driveway is yours. They poured on your land." Relief hit first, then something colder, heavier, almost mathematical. If she wanted to play by rules, I would play by them better. I filed a property encroachment notice, documented every inch, and sent certified letters to the HOA. Karen responded with a smug email about community harmony and temporary easements, but the city clerk confirmed otherwise. The slab was officially, legally, indisputably mine. That changed everything. I didn't need to shout or argue. I needed patience, signatures, and timing. So I waited, watched, and took notes. Karen's guests loved my new parking pad. They rolled up every evening, tires scraping my concrete, doors slamming, voices laughing. Each snapshot became evidence. Quietly, I installed 2 discreet security cameras, not to intimidate, but to remember. I measured angles, marked property lines, and studied the bylaws Karen loved to quote. Buried inside them was the key: homeowners could restrict access to personal property if proper notice was given and enforcement was non-disruptive. Non-disruptive. Precise. I could be both. The plan formed slowly, not out of revenge, but out of principle. She had rewritten my space into her convenience. I would rewrite it back into consequence. I scheduled the paperwork, the service calls, the notices. Every step had to be legal, clean, impossible to challenge. By the time the date arrived, Karen still believed she had won. I drafted a polite, professional notice, stamped and dated, announcing controlled access to my property for safety and liability reasons. It gave a reasonable deadline, referenced statutes, and listed enforcement procedures. No insults. No emotion. Just consequences. When it posted on the community board, neighbors whispered. Karen laughed. She called it posturing, waved it off, and kept parking on my driveway like nothing could touch her. That was the last week she would ever feel that confident. Because the morning after the deadline, my plan went live, and the neighborhood woke to something Karen never expected. My driveway was still there, but the rules around it had changed. Soon Karen would learn why, very, very soon. At sunrise, a quiet truck rolled up to my curb, and two installers stepped out with steel posts, reflective signs, and a smooth mechanical barrier that looked more like sculpture than punishment. They worked methodically, measuring along the survey stakes, drilling into my own concrete, respecting every inch of boundary the HOA had ignored. Neighbors gathered in doorways. Karen appeared halfway through, robe tied too tight, confidence wobbling like a loose hinge. The crew didn't argue with her. They didn't need to. The paperwork spoke louder than any voice on the block. My permit numbers were stamped across the work order, and the inspector's approval sat clipped above it like a crown. The barrier wasn't dramatic. It was simple, elegant, quiet, a rising arm that blocked every tire the moment it crossed my line. By noon, the driveway she had claimed as hers was no longer open space. It was private access, protected, logged, and enforced. Karen tried smiling in that brittle, neighborly way and asked when the shared feature would be unlocked again. I told her gently that it never had been shared, and that liability measures were permanent. My tone was calm. Her eyes were not. That evening, her sister arrived in a silver SUV, coasting toward the slab the way she always had. The barrier rose with a soft mechanical sigh, stopping her inches short. She leaned out the window, confused, calling Karen's name. Karen rushed across the lawn, waving, whispering, glancing at me like the truth might unravel if she looked too long. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I simply walked outside with a clipboard of my own, recorded the timestamp, and reminded them this was private property with restricted vehicle entry. Every word was scripted from the bylaws Karen had once used as a weapon. Hearing them reflected back at her felt like watching a mirror tilt under bright sun. Cars began stacking along the street at night. Guests dragged groceries from distant corners of the block. The laughter that had once filled my driveway faded into impatient murmurs and frustrated footsteps. Karen tried proposing solutions, each one framed as compromise but wrapped in entitlement. I reminded her the process she favored works both ways. And still, this was only the beginning. Because as the barrier clicked into place under the streetlights, I realized something bigger than revenge was taking shape. For the first time since she poured over my boundary, control had returned to where it belonged. And with every quiet click of the mechanism, my determination deepened, because justice delivered patiently carries a weight no argument can match, and Karen was only beginning to feel the full gravity of it all. The first week after the barrier went up felt strangely quiet, like the street itself was learning new rules. Neighbors walked slower, studying the reflective posts and the careful paint along the survey line, and though nobody said it aloud, everyone understood that something important had shifted. Karen tried to act unfazed, but the polite smile she wore now came with edges, and every conversation carried a tremor beneath the words. I kept to my routine, documenting, observing, refusing to be baited into confrontation. Instead of anger, I offered courtesy. Instead of escalation, I offered patience. And patience, when paired with evidence, becomes a force heavier than concrete. Late one afternoon, an HOA meeting notice appeared, promising a discussion about community access concerns. I attended early, took a seat near the front, and laid my folder of documents across the table like a quiet promise. Karen opened the meeting with confidence, painting herself as a guardian of neighborhood order. She called my driveway modification disruptive and spiritually inconsistent with collective design. Her tone was polished, her words rehearsed, but every sentence drifted farther from the truth. When she finally paused, the room waited. I stood, opened the survey report, and read the coordinates of my property line the way a lighthouse recites distance to shore. Then I presented photographs, timestamps, and recorded approvals. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply allowed the facts to walk the room. One board member leaned forward. Another whispered to the treasurer. Karen's expression tightened until it looked carved in stone. The city letter confirmed the violation. The inspector's note confirmed liability. And the bylaws she had once used to corner others circled back to her like an echo returning from steel walls. The board fell silent. No one defended her. No one could. Finally, the chair cleared his throat and announced a motion: the HOA would issue a formal apology and accept full responsibility for the encroachment. Karen stared at the table, hands clasped, unable to meet my eyes. Victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like balance sliding quietly back into place. But consequences do not end where apologies begin, and as the motion passed, I realized this story was no longer about a stolen driveway. It was about respect, boundaries, and the cost of entitlement, and the final lesson had not yet arrived. Outside, the evening breeze moved through the trees, and I stood beside the barrier watching the last light fold across the concrete she once claimed. In that quiet moment, I understood that real justice is rarely loud. It arrives measured, deliberate, and unforgettable, and Karen was only beginning to understand its weight. The next chapter would prove patience can roar without sound. That evening, the street glowed under pale porch lights as neighbors gathered in quiet clusters, and for the first time since the concrete was poured, I realized the story of my driveway had become the story of the entire block. Some offered small nods of support, others avoided eye contact, yet everyone sensed the invisible line between entitlement and respect had finally been drawn in steel and policy instead of whispers. Karen walked the sidewalk in slow circles, speaking softly to anyone who would listen, insisting that the barrier was unnecessary, temporary, even dramatic, but the more she talked, the more fragile her certainty sounded. I stood beside the survey stake and felt something I had not felt since the first morning of shock: calm, grounded, unshakable, because truth, once spoken clearly, does not retreat, it simply waits for courage to meet it. Later that night, a gentle knock sounded at my door, and one of the older neighbors, a man who had rarely spoken during meetings, handed me a folded note thanking me for standing firm when others felt pressured to stay silent. His words didn't celebrate conflict, they honored boundaries, and their quiet honesty carried more weight than any speech delivered inside the HOA hall, reminding me that resilience spreads when even one person proves it is possible. Karen, however, was not finished. She filed a complaint claiming emotional distress and neighborhood disruption, confident that paperwork could twist perception back into her favor, but each document returned to her like an echo tracing the same undeniable border. The board requested mediation, and I agreed without hesitation, not to win, but to prove that fairness remains strongest when it stands in daylight, and as the date approached, I prepared not with anger, but with patience, evidence, and unwavering clarity. On the evening before the session, the neighborhood air felt still and watchful, and I walked the length of my reclaimed driveway, tracing the cool surface with my steps, remembering every stage of the journey from shock to resolve, and I promised myself that tomorrow I would speak with the same calm strength that had carried me here. Whatever happened inside that room, I understood that revenge had already transformed into something deeper, because this was no longer about punishing Karen, but about restoring dignity to a space she had tried to erase, and ensuring that no neighbor would ever again believe power outranks truth. As the night settled over the roofs and the barrier shimmered beneath the streetlight, I realized the neighborhood had not merely chosen sides, it had chosen awareness, and by morning, The final chapter of this conflict would begin writing itself with every measured step toward accountability for everyone who called this place home. The mediation room smelled like paper and recycled air, and the polished oak table looked wide enough to hold every unspoken argument that had gathered between us since the day my driveway vanished. I arrived early, placed my folder at the center, and breathed slowly, reminding myself that patience, not anger, would speak for me today. When Karen walked in, she avoided my eyes, carrying the same clipboard she had once used like a badge, but the way her fingers tightened around its edge revealed a tremor that confidence could no longer hide. The mediator began with formal language about understanding, community, and resolution, yet the moment the maps and survey lines appeared, the room shifted from emotion to geometry, and truth settled across the table like weight. I described the morning the workers arrived, the letters I filed, the approvals I earned, each memory delivered calmly, deliberately, as if every detail were a brick returning to its rightful wall. Karen tried to interrupt with vague claims about intention and shared benefit, but the mediator lifted a hand and asked her to address the property boundary first, and silence answered for her before words did. She admitted the slab crossed my land. She admitted no permission had been granted. She admitted she assumed the neighborhood would accept her decision because it always had before. Hearing it spoken aloud did not feel triumphant, it felt solemn, like a bell acknowledging the distance between assumption and responsibility. The mediator recommended restitution, corrective fees, and written acknowledgement from the board, and while Karen's expression dimmed, I asked for one final condition: that policy training be added for every future HOA officer so no homeowner would face the same quiet erasure I did. The mediator nodded. The board members nodded. Even the room seemed to exhale. Karen signed the papers slowly, the pen scratching like gravel beneath rubber tires, and for the first time since this began, she finally looked at me without pretense or posture. There was no victory in my voice when I thanked the mediator. There was only closure, steady and grounded, like the barrier standing at the edge of my property, a reminder that respect must be built as deliberately as concrete. Outside, the afternoon light stretched across the pavement, and I understood that justice had not thundered or demanded attention, it had arrived patiently, step by step, proving that boundaries endure when courage refuses to move. I left the building calm, carrying no triumph, only resolve, and the certainty that what began as revenge had transformed into responsibility, a promise to guard my home, my voice, and every inch of ground that truth had finally reclaimed for myself, my neighbors, and the future we would share together. Days after mediation, the neighborhood moved with a gentler rhythm, yet beneath that calm a quiet anticipation lingered, as if everyone sensed that accountability was still traveling the last stretch of road toward Karen's door. The board's written apology circulated first, folded into mailboxes like a soft verdict, and for the first time the story existed in ink instead of rumor. I read each line slowly, letting the acknowledgement settle through me the way sunlight warms new pavement, steady, patient, undeniable. Restitution followed next: repair fees, legal costs, and the expense of removing the concrete she had poured across my boundary, and though the numbers were precise, the message behind them was larger than any invoice could measure. Workers arrived on a cool morning with saws and sanders, their engines humming at the edge of my property as the barrier stood quietly beside them like a witness that had already told its truth. Karen watched from her porch, wrapped in silence, no speeches, no objections, only the realization that consequences do not shout, they arrive with schedules, signatures, and the steady rhythm of labor undoing what arrogance once claimed. I stepped outside, not to celebrate, but to ensure everything remained respectful, and the crew nodded to me before cutting through the slab, each line tracing the same coordinates the surveyor had marked weeks earlier. Neighbors gathered again, though this time the air felt different, less tense, more thoughtful, and a few whispered that they never realized how easily boundaries could be taken until they saw what it cost to restore one. As the final section of concrete lifted away, a hollow imprint remained, a pale rectangle where loss had once stood disguised as convenience. I didn't feel triumph then, I felt renewal, like breath returning after a long, held pause. By afternoon, fresh gravel filled the opening, and the workers left a promise to return for resurfacing. Karen approached slowly, her voice low, offering a quiet apology that carried none of the sharpness that once accompanied her authority. I accepted, not because the past vanished, but because forgiveness, like property lines, becomes strongest when clearly defined. The barrier lowered with a soft click at dusk, not as revenge, but as a reminder etched into steel and experience that respect is not granted by title or board position, it is earned, protected, and never again surrendered. And in that fading light, I finally understood that strength is not the noise of victory but the discipline of boundaries kept, a promise carried forward into every future decision, reminding our neighborhood that justice, once rebuilt with patience, can stand taller than concrete and longer than pride. It became the quiet foundation beneath every step we would take forward. In the weeks that followed, the empty stretch of gravel at the edge of my home slowly transformed from a scar into a symbol, and the neighborhood, once divided by tension, began to treat it like a quiet classroom where boundaries spoke louder than arguments. Children rode past on bicycles, parents paused mid-walk, and even the newest residents listened to the story of how a driveway was taken, challenged, and finally reclaimed with patience instead of fury. I found myself answering questions at mailboxes and fences, not about revenge, but about courage, documentation, and the power of speaking calmly when pressure insists on silence. Neighbors admitted they had once believed authority always carried truth, yet the lines etched across my property proved otherwise, reminding them that fairness requires awareness, not fear. Karen, meanwhile, began walking with a different posture, no longer the unquestioned voice of the block, but a neighbor learning how to listen. She volunteered for the new policy committee, reviewed bylaws with humility, and spoke openly about the mistake that once felt unmovable as concrete. Her change did not erase the past, yet it softened the sharpness of memory, proving that accountability can shape character the same way pressure shapes stone. On a warm evening, the resurfacing crew returned, laying smooth pavement across the restored entrance, and when the final layer settled, the barrier rose one last time, not as defense, but as reminder. I stood beside it, hearing only whine through the trees, and I realized the real victory was never the obstruction itself, but the journey that taught us where respect begins. From that day forward, neighbors looked at their own boundaries with new care, measuring not only land, but words, assumptions, and intentions. The story of my driveway traveled porch to porch, reminding everyone that strength is not the roar of dominance, but the steady voice of someone who refuses to surrender what is rightfully theirs, even when standing alone at the edge of newly poured certainty. And as dusk painted the street in amber light, I understood that this journey had never been about punishing anyone. It was about protecting the simple promise every homeowner deserves, the promise that your space, your history, and your voice cannot be paved over by convenience. The driveway now stood not as territory, but as lesson, a quiet reminder that boundaries, when honored, do more than separate us. They teach us how to live beside one another with integrity, patience, and hard-earned respect that no concrete, committee, or arrogance will ever erase again. And in that quiet certainty, I felt the final shift within myself, knowing the story was not finished, only preparing to reveal the one moment that would seal everything we had learned into memory forever. On the morning the resurfaced driveway hardened into a smooth, dark ribbon of pavement, I stood at its edge and felt the story of everything that happened settle quietly inside me. The anger that once roared now moved like a distant tide, replaced by a calm strength earned through patience, boundaries, and truth. The barrier rested upright in the sunlight, not as a wall, but as a promise to myself that I would never again allow silence to erase what belonged to me. Karen walked across the lawn with careful steps, holding the final receipt for restitution like a weight she had finally decided to carry instead of resist. Her voice was soft when she spoke, not defensive, not rehearsed, but human in a way I had rarely seen from her. She admitted the power she once believed she held had never been authority at all, only assumption, and that the cost of learning that lesson had reshaped the way she saw every neighbor on our street. I listened without interruption, because revenge no longer lived in this story. What replaced it was accountability, steady and undeniable, flowing through every document, every survey line, every patient decision that led us here. I told her I would not forget what happened, but I also would not allow bitterness to anchor itself where peace had finally begun to grow. She nodded, and for the first time, the space between our homes felt honest rather than territorial. That evening, the neighborhood gathered beneath the golden wash of porch lights, and someone asked whether I ever regretted choosing patience instead of fury. I looked at the restored driveway, at the barrier standing calm and quiet, at the children laughing as they traced the painted survey line with chalk like a path of lessons left for the future, and I answered truthfully, no. Because sometimes the strongest form of revenge is not loud or dramatic, it is the simple act of protecting what is yours without cruelty, of proving that truth does not need to shout to win. As night settled across the block, I placed my hand against the cool steel post and understood that everything Karen tried to claim had instead become a story that would outlast us both, a reminder that respect begins where boundaries are honored, and that justice, when built with patience, leaves a mark far deeper than concrete ever could. And in that final stillness, I knew the driveway was no longer a battleground. It was a promise, one that would stand, quietly and unbroken, for the rest of our lives.